Okay, good evening. It's sort of my pleasure a little bit to talk about surface water quality and ecology. My colleagues and I sort of work on this throughout Canterbury, and it's a sort of privilege to be able to work in an area where you can get your feet wet and your hands wet, sort of things like that, and deal with a resource that we've all taken for granted and we really enjoy. But from a science point of view, you can look at it from many different directions, whether it be a diagram like this or a photograph. I always start from a photograph point of view, as we all sort of know what we sort of expect of our waterways, whether it be our spring-fed streams or the estuary that Matt's been talking about, and you get a reasonable feel for whether it's healthy and providing the values and the purposes you want. But we normally work with a figure like this that really makes sure we deal with all the appropriate things. It looks at things like plant growth, the nutrients coming in that affect plant growth, sedimentation that we've heard from a number of speakers tonight, which is the muds and the silts and the soils that sort of build up in our waterways, and they all sort of feed back together to either producing bacteria and contaminants that affect the ability to recreate and swim and sort of gather food from those resources, or here where we've got ecosystem health, whether the fish and the bugs and the invertebrates are healthy and interacting well with each other. So the waterways of the Waimakariri zone are quite diverse. There's a large number of them here. We've got everything from the gravel rivers like the Air River that seldom flows but still can flow significantly following heavy rain. The sort of Cust River that comes up that rises from the foothills here, and the Ashley Rakahuri. They're sort of the gravel braided rivers, or the gravel rivers that most people are familiar with. We've also got all our spring-fed streams that we've talked about. Several people have talked about at the bottom here, but also streams coming off the mountain ranges, and not the least of which remembering that we've got the Lees Valley in the inland. So in many respects, when I'm trying to describe the freshwater resources and the water quality and the ecology of these areas, we've sort of split this up into about 12 different sort of chunks, or 12 lumps, everything from Lees Valley and the headwaters here through to the wetlands and spring-fed streams right on the coast. Now, I can't talk about all of those 12 units. I'll just deal with 3 of them tonight, but it's just keeping in mind that there's quite a job here of identifying all our waterways and the pressures under them and what we need to manage. So the first one of the 3 I'll talk about here is Kaiapoi down here, and the spring-fed streams along the coast. We've got the 3 streams to the south here down near the Waimakariri River, which is the sort of Silver Stream, the Ohoka and the Cust River, and then the Cam River up here, which some would call the 3 Brooks and Cam River. So it's a series of 6 or 7 sort of spring-fed stream systems which are largely gathering groundwater. Stream health, as we normally measure it, which is the insects and the bug life that's in the stream and that tell us by their diversity and their abundance how healthy the system is it's in a relatively degraded state. In other words, a lot of the really sensitive and sort of the good insects are either not very abundant or not present there anymore, and so we largely say we're dealing with a system that's in a degraded state. Some of the problems: fine sediment, that's the muds and the silts and the sands are accumulating in these spring-fed stream systems, and that's probably one of the common themes we're seeing that's affecting the health of these waterways. The fine silts and the sands and the things are smothering the stream beds, so they're affecting the habitats and encouraging other growths. Nitrate is also a problem, and I'll illustrate that with the next slide in a minute, in that we're seeing the nutrient concentrations increasing considerably, both in the first instance generating algal growth and the aquatic plants like the water weeds growing in the waterways, but also when they get to a higher concentration they become toxic as well, and that's become a national issue in a lot of areas. Although, to contrast that, the spring-fed streams of the Waimakariri zone here are largely sort of still, most of the time, cool, clear and uncoloured. So they're still, at times, quite attractive waterways still from a first glance, and therefore they're still well worth protecting, we're still well worth improving, because they are still appreciated by many, compared to other parts of Canterbury and other parts around New Zealand where the streams have become cloudy, turbid, smelly and things like that as well. Unfortunately, they're generally unsuitable for contact recreation. Similar to what Matt was talking about earlier, the bacteria levels are getting quite high in some of these waterways, so they're not particularly safe for many of those uses. But although water quality is still degraded in many of these areas and these streams, they still support important values. There are still fish in the waterways. There's still both exotic fish like trout moving up many of these spring-fed streams, and still an abundance at times of freshwater fish as well. So they're not a foregone sort of issue. There's still plenty there that's worth maintaining and improving. I'd be negligent if I didn't mention at the end here stormwater as well, because this system here has Rangiora on the north that has an urban influence on these stream waterways as well. So it's one that there's a lot of pressure by the District Council and ourselves to try to minimise those sort of effects. So it's stormwater from Rangiora going into the Three Brooks, but also stormwater going into the Kaiapoi River from the southern area as well. Just the one little bit of data I'll give you tonight, and this is a graph of nitrate concentration down this side and in time over the last 10 years here. This is one issue that's that's illustrating a sort of national issue that we can't ignore, and that's nitrate concentrations back in about 2006. We're averaging around 6.5 milligram per litre. The government's in the last few years has released a national bottom line saying this cannot exceed 6.9 anywhere in New Zealand as an annual average, or you may wish to set even lower values than that. And you can see here in 2012, half the results were sort of above this line, and for the last 2 or 3 years, we've been getting a number of results quite a bit higher here. So this is illustrating an issue we can't ignore and we have to address. The second one is down near the coast here, Saltwater Creek above the Ashley Rakahuri there, and Taranaki and Waikuku streams here. Once again, this is Taranaki Creek flowing down through here that Gail particularly mentioned for its cultural values. Once again, in these streams, stream health is generally in a degraded state. Once again, because most of the streams, the beds of them are becoming quite filled with fine sediment, the silts, sands and soil type material smothering the beds, and largely high macrophyte growths. In other words, they're becoming clogged with macrophytes, the watercress, the monkey musk and those sort of weeds, and therefore requiring a lot more intervention to try to keep them open and keep that cleared. Maybe not as much nitrate concentration problems in these, although the nitrate is particularly elevated, because really coming to these streams, the water's mostly coming from the Ashley River. Once again, the streams are unsuitable for contact recreation, so they've got quite a high bacterial count as well. And once again, I'll reiterate what Gail mentioned earlier, particularly with Taranaki Creek, but in many of these areas, they have particularly high cultural value from both the history of the Kaiapoi and past site Tuahiwi and a long history of cultural uses. The third and final one I'll deal with here is the Ashley River itself, from the estuary here running up to the Ashley Gorge, and this area to the north, which we call the Low-Burn Fan. And it's an area that's quite different from the plains areas. Stream health is probably good in half of these rivers because they still largely retain a sort of gravel bed rather than a silty, muddy bed. Recreational, social and cultural values, they're quite important. As somebody that grew up in this district, this is the area that I often went and recreated as a small child, and I'm sure many other people did as well, in these relatively safe gravel bed rivers. In a drought, we're starting to see fine sediment accumulating in many of these streams, and we're trying to decipher whether that's mirroring the problem we've had elsewhere, or whether it's partially a consequence of the measuring we've been doing in the drought recently as well. The other one is periphyton, which is the algal slimes and algal growths on the bed of these gravel and cobble bed rivers is becoming a problem. It's generally low in most of these smaller streams, but in the Ashley Rakahuri it's becoming more of a problem, particularly when we get toxic cyanobacteria growing on the bed of these. And that's a toxic health risk. It's potentially toxic to people as well, but it's particularly been a problem particularly toxic to dogs, and we've had some dog deaths in those areas as well. So there's work to do there. One thing I would illustrate here is that whereas I'm talking about the Ashley Rakahuri here as a river system, I'd be negligent not to be mentioning that, of course, you've got Lees Valley and the Ashley Gorge behind here, and in sticking with the principle of ki uta ki tai that Gail mentioned earlier, we need to be considering these rivers as a whole system, both from the mountains to the sea as well. Okay. So that's a sort of just a quick pot of three of the areas we're dealing with, but remembering there's at least 12 groups of rivers and streams that we're trying to summarise and deal issues with. The community outcome that the Zone Committee's been dealing with is that water quality and quantity of spring-fed streams maintains and improves, and it maintains and improves mahinga kai gathering and has diverse aquatic life. The theme I've been showing here was with sediment and bacteria and other things accumulating there. Once again, it's at risk, and there's a bit of there's a bit of direction to go here to either to halt and improve that situation.